thanks to everybody for joining us on the webinar today. I think at this point, if you are a teacher or you are working with kids in some way, school has begun for you. So I really appreciate your taking the time to walk through some of the changes that have been made to the model content frameworks and ELA literacy, as well as to take some time to dig into a few prototypes in a little bit more detail. So with me on the call today are Bonnie Hain, who's the Senior Advisor for ELA Literacy for PARCC at Achieve, and also with me is Sue Pimentel, who's one of the lead authors of the Common Core State Standards in ELA Literacy. And they'll both be taking some time to talk with you about the content frameworks and the item prototypes. And also, of course, ever-present Allison Barr, who's keeping us all on track as we work through things today. So as I understand, all of your lines have been placed on mute. We're going to save time for questions and a little interactivity at the end of the webinar using the chat feature. So at any time, you might want to just pop open that chat window so that you can be sending any questions or any thoughts that we need to hear during the course of the presentation. Then, of course, we'll be using it a little bit more directly at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm Doug Sobde. I'm the Director of PARCC Instructional Supports and Educator Engagement, and also work directly with Educator Leader Cadres. And I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. So Allison, why don't you move the PowerPoint forward, please? Our objectives for today are to gain a better understanding of the revisions to the content frameworks, talk about how the content frameworks and the PARCC assessment system align as really illustrated through the PARCC item prototypes. We'll provide a few suggestions for communications and supporting materials, but really that's going to be an opportunity for you to provide PARCC with suggestions for communications and supporting materials. And also we'll save a little bit of time so you all can learn from each other about how you are already using or intend to use in the near future the content frameworks and the item prototypes. So I'm going to run through these next couple of slides pretty quickly because I've done them a number of times with you all. Just to refresh everybody's memory, there are two primary purposes of the content frameworks. The first was to inform development of the assessment system with a direct link to the assessment blueprints, and then also to support implementation of the Common Core State Standards with states and districts. So they have a sense of ways that the ELA literacy standards might be implemented and organized to be most effective. The audiences for the model content frameworks are state and local curriculum directors, teachers and building administrators, and then, of course, folks who are directly responsible for the development of the assessment system itself. As you'll recall, the development of the content frameworks was a state-led process, and it brought together ELA literacy content experts from across the PARCC states, as well as members of the standards writing team, most notably Sue Pimentel, who is with us today. In November 2011, there was essentially an academic year 11-12 release of the model content frameworks. And to get to that point, PARCC held 3 rounds of feedback, including a final public comment period right before the final revisions were made, which included K-12 educators, administrators, higher ed faculty, school board members at the local and state level, parents, and some students. And not surprisingly to those of you who work with kids on a regular basis, in many cases their feedback was among the most insightful and astute in how we could help make things clearer and more workable. And then over the course, before we move on, over the course of the year, PARCC received some additional feedback just over the course of the year, and then held another round of state feedback, another round of public comment right there in June 2012. And since June, the documents were revised for release in August. August 20th, actually, is when they went live. So again, over half of the feedback that was received from that public feedback period was from K-12 educators, which is important because it helps us to remember that the content frameworks and the PARCC assessment system is being very attentive to the needs of teachers in the field. The approach of the content frameworks was really to provide one possible model for how the standards could be organized to integrate the 4 strands of that we see in the Common Core State Standards and ELA literacy. And PARCC's been very careful to respond to what is essentially a pretty strong tension between the need and the request from the field to provide, something that folks could be building on and working off of, without being prescriptive in any way. So it's very important for people to keep in mind that the content frameworks are not a complete guide to curriculum development, were never intended to be, but rather just a focus on framing the critical advances in the standards. So both for your own learning as well as the work that you're going to be doing in terms of professional development with folks who are, brand new to the PARCC assessment system and the content frameworks, this is a very important point to continue to make. We can go ahead, Allison. Thanks. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue Pimentel, who's going to talk a little bit about what happened as a result of the public feedback, the types of revisions that were made, and then she's going to take you through a few additional slides before turning it over to Bonnie. So, Sue?
Hey, thanks, Doug, and good afternoon to everyone. I think I'll just start out by saying that, as I've moved around the country, even with SBAC states, that people are using your PARCC model content framework, and that has so much credit is due to so many of you on the phone and maybe others who couldn't join us today. So I just wanted to start off to say that it was really important to allow the content framework to be out there for a year, people using it, and then come back to us about what still needed to be clarified, what still needed to be fixed. Overall, I think the response was still very positive, but there were some things, as you see here, no matter how many times we read it over and the like, we had to correct a few typos here and there. We also, people asked us for some clarifications, and just to give you an example of a couple of these, a couple of people asked us, can you make the connection between writing to inform and explain or writing arguments? Can you make that connection to writing a research project? Can you make sure that people understand that you can, that those two are connected and can be connected? They don't always have to be. Another kind of clarification was, what does it mean when you say extended text? What does it mean when you say a short text? And so we tried to give some more guidance there. We updated it in several ways as well. For example, there was research underway on text complexity. That research is now complete, and so there was some updating to do with respect to that. People asked us to make sure we emphasize two aspects for students. One is that the volume of reading is important, that it is close reading, but it is also the volume of reading that students need to be doing independently and otherwise. That's really important, both for their reading skill and building knowledge. And also to make sure that there's a role for students in generating their own questions and generating their own topics as they do research. So you'll see those kinds of changes as you look at the new and improved model content framework. The big issue, and it actually had come up, it had bubbled a little bit when we were in the process of the first edition, if you will, of the model content frameworks, and that was that narrative writing felt like it was sort of off in a corner by itself. And it didn't seem to have taken on the importance that we all know it deserves in writing, certainly as students are learning to write, but as students move up the grades, the standards actually talk about it, whether if you look over in the science and social studies standards, even though there isn't a narrative writing per se, it talks about the importance of a narrative description in science and in social studies. And in Appendix A, it also talks about the power of narrative writing and that it goes beyond a narrative story. And then and Bonnie will talk a little bit about this when she talks more about the PARCC, because of course there's this wonderful connection between the model content frameworks and PARCC. And that is how narrative is going to show up on PARCC. And and if you'll just turn the next slide, Allison, I'll show people so you can see. And you might have heard some about this. So essentially what we wanted to do, and the Rapid Response Feedback Group was just brilliant in helping us fix, if you will, update, if you will, the PARCC content framework with respect to narratives, to really give it its full power. And so there were two distinct forms. One is narrative story, which many of us, when we think of narrative, we think immediately of. Real or imagined situation, using time as the structure. And it can come in the form of biographies, autobiographies, just pure fiction, etc. But there's also something called narrative description. And that means, as we worked on the wording of this, creates a vivid impression of a person, phenomena, event, or procedure. So you can see how in history or social studies, it could be a description about, a vivid description, if you will, about an event. It could be a vivid description about an individual, a hero in history, etc. And in science, you can have descriptions of procedures. You can also have, again, descriptions of events that occur, so that it really allows the power of narrative to live. And if you'll do the next slide, we'll show you what change we've made, which is the biggest change. So you'll notice here, for those of you who may remember, that in the old version of this chart was that writing narratives was off to the right of the research project, sort of standing there by itself, looking rather lonesome. And so the feedback that came in is pull it in. It is an important form of writing, of course, and in the PARCC you'll see it show up as really writing to text. So that means that one might write a narrative story based on a story the passage you've been given, and you might be asked to write about the character and write another adventure for that character. You also might be given some social studies and science text and asked to then write a narrative description of some text that you've just received. So the big change here is pulling narrative in with writing to inform and explain, with writing arguments. And you'll notice at the top here, it's not writing about text, it's now writing to text. And you'll see again this show up in PARCC. So this was the big shift that was asked for. We got back from the feedback, and certainly as folks who were working on PARCC felt that was important as well. And so I think folks that had worried about the fact that they thought narrative was out there and wasn't important now has its rightful place. And with that, we can go to the next slide. And the next slide. So I'm going to do a little bit of talking and then hand it over to Bonnie to do the nitty-gritty here about the PARCC items. But as one of the lead authors of the Common Core, I want to say that I am thrilled with the work that is going on, because I have seen too many assessments that are not aligned to what we've asked teachers to teach and for students to learn. And then it just does become a distraction. So here, the fundamental advance I see here is to really reward quality instruction aligned to the standards. And you will see this come through as I talk a little bit about the shifts that are included in the standards. Next slide. So some core commitments here, very important, and make sure that as we move forward, we hold each other's feet to the fire on this. So the first commitment that PARCC has made is that we really have text worth reading. I mean, this is an opportunity, while it's an assessment certainly, that there are texts that are interesting, that give us good information, that are compelling in some way. And so PARCC has really made a commitment to use authentic text. Rather than commission pieces, which would be much easier, by the way, for the PARCC states to opt for. And in some cases, ask someone to write something on something. But they tend not to be, they haven't been vetted very well, they haven't stood the test of time, and so text worth reading. The second is questions worth answering. One of the great hopes, I think, of these standards and of the PARCC assessment is that when you have a series of questions for a text, that after you've answered those questions, you really know something about what you've read, rather than it feel like a random set of questions that have been asked, that this really allows students to have a deep encounter with the text. The next one is that better standards demand better questions or better items. Instead of reusing existing items, PARCC is committed to developing and is in the process of developing custom items to the standards rather than pulling things off the shelves. And one little aside here, I made a session with folks from around the country that are assessment writers, and they had thought that before they went through the training, that they were going to be able to just pick things up off the shelves, and they say, ooh, wait a minute, not so fast. And PARCC has really committed to this. The last one is the fidelity of the standards. that the PARCC evidences, I don't know how many of you have read them, but they are rooted in the language of the standards. So sometimes you can see when you get to the assessment phase that people write these objectives or they write these assessment, hoo-haws, if you will, and they don't have any resemblance to the standards themselves. Well, in this case, very carefully, the PARCC states have worked on evidences that are rooted in the language of the standards. So very pleased to see that. Next. So if you've gone to some of the trainings, and I believe most of you have here, you've heard what are the key shifts. So one of them is text complexity, regular practice with complex text. Next one is reading and writing grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And knowledge, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And what I want to show you in the next couple of slides are the advances that the PARCC assessment is taking to really bring these shifts alive. And this next slide just kind of shows you that as students engage with complex text, then they extract and employ evidence, and as they do that, it allows them to build knowledge. And that's why the shifts are key, and they are central to the standards. Next slide. So there are 9 specific advances, and they really do tie in beautifully with the 3 core shifts. So the first one, when I said the shift 1 was regular practice with complex text and its academic language, well, what is it that PARCC's doing to make sure that that shift is realized? Well, they are very serious about building a staircase of text complexity to make sure students are on track each year for college and career reading. They're using quantitative measures. They're using qualitative measures. They've just had a long session in Florida in terms of selecting passages that will work, and that work will continue. So that's a key one. The second one, and this is really important because so often in assessments we pack them full with passages for students to read, but we forget that we really want them to be able to carefully read them, to closely read them, to have time to reread them so that they can really understand what it is the author is saying rather than racing through passages. And you will find this in the setup of the assessment that PARCC is putting together. The third, I know a lot of people buzz around the country around academic vocabulary, how important it is, and you will find in every passage, and Bonnie, correct me if I'm wrong, but in every passage that a student is asked to read, there will be a question about an important academic vocabulary word, not one that's sort of obscure or not consequential, but one that's consequential to understanding the text, and ask students to draw the meaning of that word from context. Next slide. So the next one is reading, writing grounded in evidence from text. This is one of the areas I am most excited about in terms of the assessment. You will see that throughout the assessment, even including selected response items, that we will be asking students to cite evidence for their answers. Now, here's why I think this is so important. As teachers, send students in, even in a selected response, they get the right answer, they get the wrong answer to the multiple choice question, and we say, well, I don't know, did they guess? Were they guessing? What was it they weren't understanding? Or did they get it right, and I don't know whether they really understood or they didn't? Well, on many of the questions, PARCC will be asking a follow-up question and asking students to either drag and drop or to point to or to shade in the evidence or select an answer that shows the evidence for their answer. So it can really tell us as educators what our students are understanding and what they're not. The next is the fifth one, is that there will be questions that include more than one right answer. Sometimes we get so reductive, I think, on these assessments. And in this case, we're going to allow students to generate a range of richer insights and then support that insight with evidence. So there's not just going to be one right answer on some of these questions. Obviously, number 6, which is writing to sources. You saw that on the chart in the model content framework. It's writing to text. It's writing to sources here rather than writing to decontextualized expository prompts. So students will be given text, and then they will be asked a question about them. In some cases, they will be asked to synthesize a text, two or more texts. In other cases, they may ask to do an analysis of a text. And also connected to that is narrative writing. So I want to now say, sort of harken back to our model content framework and how that has grown. So there will be rigorous expectations for narrative writing as well. So students will be given a passage, and then they will be asked to write a narrative about it. And it could be a narrative story, or it could be a narrative description. So we've really given power, again, to narrative writing there. Next. And shift 3 is building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So this is another area, again, that I think is so critical and mirrors the national assessment for educational progress. And that is that it's not just an ELA test, but it is a test that shows and gives students the opportunity to show what they can do across the disciplines in terms of their reading and writing. So the passages, there will be science passages, there will be history passages, and obviously there will be literature passages. Again, to reflect what the Common Core said is a priority and what we know is so necessary for students to be college and career ready. The last one, which I think is exciting, and I think as we move forward with PARCC, we will find ways. We've got a simulation. It's called a simulation right now because, as you know, in terms of a research project, oftentimes that may take a couple of days or more days to do it. We don't have the opportunity to be able to do that at this point. But what PARCC has made a commitment to doing, though, is giving students an anchor text, asking them to read it, asking them then to respond to it, and then giving some additional texts that pertain to a particular topic that the anchor text explains, and then ask students a question that asks them to then synthesize their response to the text as a whole. So there's a sense of how important research is. You'll see this in the model content framework that students are supposed to be doing regular research. So again, PARCC has said we really want to give students opportunities to do this, and they have a simulated research part of the assessment. So what's different about PARCC's development process? And then I'm going to hand it right over to Bonnie. So we first developed the model content framework, and the commitment at the time we were developing them, and I know Doug can speak to this as well as Bonnie, and that is that it really was to guide the development of instruction, but also to inform the assessment blueprint design. So they weren't to be, one to be written in one room, another to be written in another room, and sort of never the twain shall meet. That was the commitment. And I can tell you that it's serious. So any meetings that I've been in, we've gone back to the model content framework, we've gone back to the shifts, we've gone back to the Common Core state standards, and said, is this what the standards say, so on. So for the first time, PARCC is communicating in the same voice to teachers as we are to assessment developers, which I think is just key. And it's designing the assessments around the exact same critical content the standards expect of students and teachers. And you can see this by the 9 advances connected to the 3 shifts. So I am thrilled. And with that, I don't know whether to hand it back to Doug or hand it over to Bonnie.
I'll step in. Good afternoon to everybody, soon to be good evening. I'll start. We're going to walk through some of the sample items with you, but to start, I think it's important to know how did we get these sample items and tests, these prototype items and tests. We began with teams of classroom teachers and higher education faculty from the Institute for Learning at the University of Pittsburgh. And they developed conceptual models for the prototypes, really thinking through how exactly do you incorporate the standards and these advances and shifts that Sue talked about. What are the concepts that one would put in place that would allow you to make measure of those on a large-scale assessment? We released in an ITN the conceptual pieces that we had at the time in December, and ETS and Pearson, who are the contractors that are working with us, they saw that IT, and in order to respond to that, they developed some sample items, and that provided us for some fodder for some additional prototype items. Reviews and feedback from members of the Common Core State Standards Writing Team, from members of the Content Technical Working Groups, from PARCC state leaders, many of you are on the phone, and content experts, higher education faculty, leadership team members, lots of people weighed in on these items to make sure that we really were staying true to the Common Core state standards, to the shifts, to the advances that Sue walked you through just a moment ago. So let's go to the next slide. And one of the things that came out of the conceptual models from the Institute for Learning that I think is really important about the items and about the design of the PARCC assessment is that we realize that two standards are always in play, whether we're talking about reading items or writing items, the type of response mode. Reading Standard 1, the ability for students to use evidence, and Reading Standard 10, the ability for students to read and comprehend a range of complex texts, were critical to the core of what the Common Core speak to, and those standards are always in play in the items that we're looking at. So if we'll go to the next slide. Also, what came out of the conceptual work, that really there were three item types that PARCC would use to measure the Common Core state standards on its summative assessment. And the three item types, the first are evidence-based selected response items, and we're going to look at some samples of each of these. So don't worry too much if the Prose isn't lining up yet. The evidence-based selected responses really are a traditional selected response question with a second selected response question that asks students to show evidence from the text. So this underscores the importance of Reading Anchor Standard 1 and the connection of showing the evidence to any conclusions or generalizations drawn really allows us to stay true to that standard of having students connect the text in that textual evidence as they're reading. The next type of innovative conceptual item that came forward was a technology-enhanced constructed response item. And here we're using technology to capture student comprehension of text in ways that were difficult to score by machine for large-scale assessment. So there's lots of different technologies. We can call it drag and drop, cut and paste, highlighting text, shading text, moving items to show relationships. The key here is that in the classroom, to demonstrate that students have comprehension and show evidence of the standards, students manipulate the text. And these technology-enhanced constructed response items are really designed to allow students to manipulate the text in the same kinds of ways, but in ways that allow us to have some machine scoring. And that will, of course, reduce the cost and the time it takes to take the assessment, and therefore the time it takes to receive results back. The third type of item was a Prose constructed response item. Here, these are written responses, likely to be hand-scored, that elicit evidence that students have understood a text or text that they've read, and to communicate that using their best written expression and knowledge of language and conventions. And there are actually 4 of those items on the annual performance-based assessment. And we'll go to the next slide. The PARCC Summative Assessment has 2 components to it, a performance-based assessment component and an end-of-year assessment component. And the slide that you're looking at here talks about the 3 types of tasks that make up the performance-based assessment component. So there is a literary analysis task, a narrative task, and a research simulation task. And we'll talk a little bit more about what each of these constitutes, but I hope that you'll see a direct correlation here to the model content frameworks and the way that ideas were conceptualized across the model content frameworks in terms of the modules. So we'll go to the next slide. So let's talk first about the sample literary analysis task. This was a grade 10 task. And in this test, students were would be asked to read two texts. One, Ovid's Daedalus and Icarus, and then the second one, a poem by Anne Sexton, To a Friend Whose Work Has Come to Triumph. And we'll go to the next slide, please. In the literary analysis task, students consider two literary texts that are worthy of study. Then they answer a few of those evidence-based selected response and technology-enhanced constructed response questions. And that's to demonstrate their ability to do close analytic reading and also to compare and synthesize ideas. What's important to realize is that these shorter questions, they are designed to help students think through and gather ideas in order to do the next part of the test, which is to write a literary analysis about the two texts. So let's see what this might look like. Let's look at the next slide, please. Quickly, a note that in grade 10, we have a 70% informational, 30% information, 70% informational, 30% literature range. In this case, it happens to be that we're looking at the literary analysis, so we're looking at that what would form the 30%. The quality of the text or texts worth reading. The story of Daedalus and Icarus from Ovid's Metamorphosis is a classic work. It's been inspirational to painters, to poets. And Anne Sexton really refashions the themes of this myth in a dramatic fashion. And that's important because one of our standards at this grade level asks students to really consider how one author transforms the text of another author. And so this is going to make this textual pairing a worthwhile pairing. And we won't go into the quantitative and qualitative means to determine that the texts are appropriate for grade 10, but they were deemed suitable for grade 10 through a validation process. Let's go to the next slide. And the grade 10 example that we've provided, it's not a complete literary analysis task. I want you to be aware that we would write more items to fill out, but we wanted to give you some examples of items. There are two evidence-based selected response items here and one prose constructed response item. So you would see, to fill the literary analysis task out, you would see a technology-enhanced constructed response item and perhaps one or two additional evidence-based or technology-enhanced constructed response items. So let's move to the next slide. And here is an example. This is what would be the last part of the task. This would be that prose constructed response, and the other items are going to lead students to be able to address this. And you can see that here students have read the two texts, and now they're being asked to analyze how Sexton transforms Daedalus and Icarus. And you'll notice that students are asked to consider what's emphasized, absent, or different in the two texts. When we talk about the prompts or the items aligning with the standards, that language is coming straight out of the standards. So we want the items to really show very clearly the connection to the standards themselves. And then you'll notice that the students are reminded that they are to develop their essay by providing textual evidence from both texts. And that is a critical element because, as we've noticed, Standard 1 is always at play when we're measuring reading. So we'll go to the next example. This is an example of an evidence-based selected response item. And in this item, you see, as I described it, there are two selected response questions that together form a single item. The first one asks students to which of the sentences states an important theme about human behavior as described in the text. And then in the second part, students are going to apply Standard 1 to demonstrate what evidence supports the theme that they selected. And this is an item that allows for partial credit. If students get Part A and are able to pick 2 pieces of evidence rather than the 3 that they need for full credit, they would still get partial credit for this item. You can see it's a relatively rigorous text set, as well as a relatively rigorous task where students really have to evaluate the context of each of these lines and whether or not they really do support the theme about human behavior that they've chosen. We'll go to the next slide, please. This is an example of a vocabulary item, and Sue stressed that the PARCC assessments would connect vocabulary and Standard 1, that all items require students to look at the evidence from the text to demonstrate their comprehension. And again, you can see that Part A, Part B, evidence-based selected response there, helping students to use the context of the text to help to see the meaning of a word. And one of the things that's really critical in understanding vocabulary items on the PARCC assessments is that the claim asks students to demonstrate that they can connect the context of the passage to the definition of a word, that the context helps to define the academic vocabulary. And the passages and the questions are being carefully worded so that we don't do the old style gotcha where you either know the word or you don't. We're not measuring do you know the word or do you not know the word. It's really about can you use the context to make meaning and show an understanding of the meaning of the text. So let's go to the next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about the second type of task on the performance-based assessment, which is the research simulation task. And this is a grade 7 task, and it's built around this idea of what happened to Amelia Earhart, which is a mystery that is engaging, relatively engaging at the middle school grade level. So let's move to the next slide. In the research simulation task, students have 2 sessions. We envision that they will both occur on the same day, but there might be a short, quick break between the 2. First, students will begin by reading an extended text, an anchor text that introduces the topic. Again, there are those short EBSR and TECR items. They're designed to help students to gather the details about the passage to support their understanding. And then because our colleagues in higher education shared how very important it is for students in the research process to be able to summarize and to do a short summary or analysis of a piece, students are asked to write that Prose constructed response, the summary of the piece that they read, the anchor piece. After that, students read 2 additional sources, and one of them may be a multimedia text. And this should be on a topic that ties the research together. They're learning more about the topic, and then they answer some more of those items, EBSR and TECR, to gather more information. And finally, they're synthesizing all of that information together into an analytic essay that's using the textual evidence from the text. So let's go to the next slide, please. And again, you can see that the text represents the quality of text that we've been talking about, content-rich nonfiction on a topic that's historically significant. And in this particular set of items, you see that we've put together text of various types, a text that is a web page, a text that is a multimedia video clip, and a text that is an article. And so all with very rich historical context. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Again, we don't have the full set of what would be a research simulation task where all of the items are there, but we did provide one example of that first summary item, an example of what a technology-enhanced constructed response item might look like, and then a Prose constructed response item that ties it all together, that synthesis. And we'll go to the next slide and look at some items. So here's an example of that first summary question, a Prose constructed response. Based on the information in the text, biography of Amelia Earhart, write an essay that summarizes and explains the challenges Earhart faced throughout her life. What I think is important to know about this is that we didn't just say summarize the text. We really tied it to a very text-dependent question to get students not to summarize in any way, but to really focus in on the challenges that move through that biography, so students aren't just regurgitating the text. They're really having to first evaluate what those challenges are and then summarize them. And we'll move to the next item. The end Prose constructed response is for this research simulation might be this item where students are told they've read 3 texts. All 3 include the claim that Earhart was a brave, courageous person. There's the 3 texts. And then the students are asked to consider the argument that each author uses to demonstrate Earhart's bravery, and they're asked to write an essay that analyzes the strengths of the arguments in at least 2 of the texts and to support their ideas with textual evidence. So you can see a very rigorous item for 7th graders, truly comparing and synthesizing ideas across multiple texts. And we'll move to the next item. In this item, this is when we say that the technology-enhanced constructed response items and the evidence-based selected response items will help students to gather the ideas that they need in order to write that Prose constructed response in the way that research simulated would first allow you to read and really process the text before you did your writing. You'll note here that students are looking at 3 claims, first highlighting the one that is supported by the most relevant and sufficient facts that are found in the text, Earhart's final resting place belief found. One of the things that's important to note is that all 3 of those claims could be made about the text. The issue is which one has the most relevant and sufficient facts, and that's going to help them when they go to write that piece where they're analyzing the strength of the argument. They're beginning that process through this item. And then, of course, we ask for evidence, click on 2 facts within the article that best provide evidence to support the claim selected in Part A. And you'll note in this technology-enhanced item, what makes it technology-enhanced, of course, is besides the clicking on the claim, they are going into the text and they're actually able to pick chunks of the text, any 2 chunks of the text representing the facts that best support the claim, the evidence for the claim that they've picked in Part A. So you can really see that they're manipulating the text in the way that they would maybe in the classroom to show their full understanding, and yet this is a machine scorable item. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk just a moment about the narrative text task. This is a grade 6 task based on an excerpt from the Julie of the Wolves. Next slide, please. In the narrative writing task, students will read 1 or 2 brief texts. It's actually, that slide should say students read 1 brief text. I apologize for that. It's a single text. Meant to be read in under 10 minutes or less, and answer a few questions to help clarify their understanding. Again, the short questions, EBSR, TECR, they're designed to get the students able to gather what they need to write. And then students write either a narrative story or a narrative description. And as Sue talked about the clarifications to the model content frameworks, you can see that here in PARCC we have both types of narrative writing represented as possibilities in that narrative writing task. Next slide, please. The example here, when we talk about the quality of the passage and authentic text, here we're using a passage from the Newbery Medal winner in 1973. Next slide. This sample provides one example of an evidence-based selected response, one technology-enhanced constructed response, and one Prose constructed response. And you should be able to see how those shorter pieces are going to help students build towards an understanding to be able to write that end piece. Next slide, please. Here you see in the Prose constructed response, we're told that there's a strong character. Think about the details. This is going to be the end where we end. The passage ends with Mayax waiting for the black wolf to look at her. And then students are to continue the story where the passage ended, and they're using what they've learned about character, in this case about the character Mayax, to continue the story in a narrative story format. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here's an example of, oops, I'm waiting on the next slide. This is an example of a vocabulary item, again, and you see evidence-based selected response, and you're going to see that the vocabulary here, which is uses this word regal, is tying into a key characteristic in the passage. It's one of the key passages that helps to define Mayax's relationship and her character in relationship to her father. Let's go to the next slide, please. And you see here another evidence-based selected response question. And again, we're getting at what are Mayax's feelings about her father, and what's the evidence that talks about Mayax's feelings for her father, developing Mayax's character, getting the students to really gather that information. Next slide. In this last example for 6th grade, this is an example of a technology enhanced, and it's also an example, Sue talked about the fact that the PARCC assessments will sometimes allow for more than one correct response. And this is an example of that, where the students choose one word that describes Mayax, and so we're trying to describe her character. There are 2 possible choices that are accurate. The students then go into the text and find 2 sentences for part B and C that help support whatever they chose. So if they say that Mayax is imaginative, they might choose one set of sentences for details. If they say she's observant, they might choose a different set. Both choices, imaginative and observant, are equally right. Students are allowed to be divergent thinkers and to show that. And I hope you see now how these 3 items that we looked at, these short answers, help to develop the student to be able to talk about or think through the idea of Mayax as a character when they're going to continue that character as a character in their own story. And we'll go to the next slide. So there is also an end-of-year assessment. We have here short to medium-length passages. We have some examples from grade 3. These items are all machine scored, all scored for reading, no writing, only reading. And if you go to the next slide, we'll look quickly. The end-of-year assessment draws on critical thinking skills, comparison and synthesis of ideas by focusing on the various reading standards as they call for critical reading and they call for comparison and synthesis of ideas. Next slide, please. And here you're going to see the passage that developed these end-of-year sample items are from a science passage from a 3rd grade textbook. Next slide, please. You see we're going to look at one evidence-based selected response item and one technology-enhanced constructed response item. Next slide. So here's the evidence-based selected response. This first part A, what's one main idea of how animals live? That's a standard I think you would see in many current state assessments. But look at part B, always getting that evidence, that standard 1 piece, which sentence from the article best supports the answer to part A. And let's go to the next slide. And here, another example from this that might be part of this passage set. Drag the words from the word box into the correct locations on the graphic to show the life cycle of a butterfly as described in How Animals Live. And here, the students, of course, are dragging in order the life cycle of the butterfly as it's given in How Animals Live. And what's important about this item to notice is that this is a science text, and scientists often start from number 1 as the adult, and then the adult lays an egg, and then from there we move around. But in fact, in the third grade passage that the students read, it starts with the idea of the egg, and the egg grows into an adult. And so this is not testing a student's knowledge of the life cycle of a butterfly. It's not a science test. It's really saying to the students, go in and read and tell us, according to the text itself, what's the sequence that's described there. So students have to go in and find that evidence in order to apply their understanding. And this is a low-level third grade item of application, but we imagine there will be graphic organizers and other ways for students to apply their knowledge in more complex ways as we move through the grade levels. Next slide, please. And with that, I think it's time to turn over to Doug Sobde.
All right. Thanks a lot, Bonnie Hain. Really appreciate all that great information, and same to you, Sue, really giving a nice background on the role of the standards and the content frameworks in developing the PARCC assessment system. So we do have a few questions coming in already, and I'm just going to ask folks who have been asking those questions to hang on for a little bit. We're making note of them, but we're going to engage in a little interactivity here. Now that you've heard about more about the standards, obviously, the content frameworks, and then also the item prototypes, to raise a few questions for you so that you can learn from each other, and also so that PARCC can learn from you. So Allison, why don't we move ahead? So using the chat feature in your webinar control panel there, what we're hoping people will do is feel comfortable to go ahead and respond to everybody to this question. We're going to do this a few different times with a few different questions. And the first one is, I have used or will use the model content frameworks and the item prototypes to ... And we're looking forward to seeing what you all have to say. I'll go ahead and give you all a little bit of wait time to see those questions or the responses pop up in that chat window. And as they come up, I'll just go ahead and read them to folks as you're typing as well. First person writes, professional development, engage in collaborative discussions at the school, make sure folks are prepared, collaborate with colleagues in curriculum mapping, help plan future units, help me collaborate with my colleagues. Thanks to those folks who have already responded. Understand how the design and the layout of the assessments will work with units, reevaluate texts, align the types of prototypes to classroom assessments, use content frameworks to analyze gaps in the curriculum. And on that one, I should note that the content frameworks are actually one of a few different tools that are out there to help think about alignment of instructional materials. Certainly the content frameworks are a fantastic resource. The revised publishers' criteria in ELA literacy are another wonderful resource. And then also the work that's going on with about 20 states around using the EQUIP rubric that was originally the tri-state rubric. And you can go to the achieve.org website to learn more about that tri-state rubric and the EQUIP work. There's also a really nice tool as well. And what should be noted is that all three of these documents, the content frameworks, the publisher's criteria, and the tri-state rubric, have all sort of been interacting and affecting each other. So you can't go wrong with any of them, and know that if you do choose just one over the other two, you're still working in line with the other one. So I'm seeing a few other pieces come in, developing curriculum that folks are going to be using these tools for. Use the objectives in the gray box to identify measurable student learning objectives for teachers. Assist in curriculum mapping, synthesizing synthesizing materials into a cohesive time frame, provide workshops, create your own high-quality assessments. Absolutely. Well, great. Changing my own teaching practice, revising my test to include text and multiple correct answers. Wonderful. All right, why don't we go to the next question, Allison? Here are some other pieces that, PARCC staff had thought about, and I think you all hit on nearly all of them already. But one that I didn't see was supporting vertical planning, that these could be really useful in not only the work within your grade level, but across grade levels. And then another is to facilitate that cross-disciplinary discussion, right, so that across the schoolhouse or across the district, your colleagues are recognizing the need for literacy to be co-owned across the schoolhouse. We'll move to the next question. Thanks, Allison. So how are the expectations for students changing? And what does that mean for how you work with your students? And respond via chat again. How do you see the expectations for students changing? What does that mean for your work with your students? Increased rigor, increased accountability, creating classroom activities and assignments, incorporating. Students are held more accountable for truly showing understanding, providing evidence for answers. Rather than remembering, students need to transfer skills to new experiences, more conceptual and analytical thinking. One of the ways that I talked about this on the math webinar was actually shifting the culture from choosing the best answer to creating the best answer. And certainly the standards in the PARCC assessment system are definitely moving in that direction. Critical thinking, close reading, more text-based evidence, synthesis and comparison to contrast work, finding texts that go together in our complex will be a challenge for sure. Shared ownership for text understanding in all content areas. Students must not just answer why, but point to the text itself. The ability to read well is at the center of all performance. Increased rigor also means lots of professional learning for teachers who must learn new ways of teaching critical thinking. Another one coming through, we have to figure out how to provide the scaffolds that encourage students to grapple with complex texts without doing too much of the work for them. Always a temptation, isn't it? Very important to be looking for ways to keep it in the hands of kids. Looking back for evidence, regardless of experience outside the classroom, all students can access a common text and focus on that. Great. A definite shift from memorizing definitions to understanding word meaning. Increased higher order thinking skills for students. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. I see one more coming through, and we'll move to the next question. Integration of content areas for more well-rounded, less fragmented education. Now, think about the opportunities for coherence, not just within your own content area, but across the content areas now, with both the ELA standards as well as those literacy standards. We'll move to the next question, Elton. So now here's your chance to weigh in on what PARCC should do next, right? So when PARCC releases the next set of sample items, it will be helpful to have blank in order to more effectively understand and use these items. So what should we be including the next time PARCC creates the sample items? And I'll hold on to the second question in a moment. Model answers. Scored student exemplars. Scoring keys, annotated samples. I think Bonnie and Sue are both clapping and cheering that these are going to be so important to get out there.
Yes,
the text complexity, the text complexity aligns with the rubric you shared. At ELC2 in Chicago, right? So being able to get that text complexity rubric out there. The Prose constructed responses, models, anchors, and exemplars with score reasoning. Nice. Hot links to the examples. That's a good note for the website, Allison. Examples of partial credit, exemplars of each part of the rubric, science and history passages at the grade 10 level, so looking for some more specificity. And Bonnie, I don't think I heard you say it this time. I've heard you say it in the past, but this was just phase one of PARCC's release of sample and prototype items.
That's the hope.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Bonnie.
So that's the hope, that as we move through the item development process, that we will have more items at different grade levels. So people who aren't teaching at the grade levels that are there can see their own grade levels represented, and also that we would flesh out some more different types of items that people would be able to see.
Nice, thanks. So the next kind of thread that I see coming through in the chat box right now is not just showing exemplars of student responses, but actually showing a range, right? What does it mean to be low, medium, and high, right? So really getting at that nuance so that teachers can be more, have all the tools that they need to be able to work with their students. Videos of teachers scoring and analyzing student responses, vertical grade progression of the samples. Rachel, could you write a little bit more about what you mean by vertical grade progression of the samples? How are the TECRs going to be handled if schools opt for the paper-based testing option? Is that still an option? Well, so this gets at a slightly different question about feasibility and issues around technology, and the PARCC Governing Board is still having conversations about what possibilities might exist around paper-based options. It's important for everybody to note, though, that the current the current talking points around this really drive right back to the proposal itself, which is that the assessments will be given via computer for all grades 3 through 11, and in grades 3 through 5 there would be an option for students to respond via paper and pencil. But that option, as written in the proposal, does not exist for grades 6 through 11. Now, that said, the Governing Board is having conversations about this, taking into account the results of the technology gap analysis, technology readiness tool surveys that have been going on this spring and will continue this fall and into next spring again. So as more information becomes available, the Governing Board will be able to speak, I think, more clearly about this particular issue. A few questions coming in about accommodations now, and it's important here to note that this first round of sample items was not really intended to demonstrate how accommodations will work. They were intended to focus on the shifts in the standards and the shifts in the assessment system. But accommodations is right up next. It's on deck, and the next thing for one of the next things for PARCC really to be speaking more broadly about, and it's going to happen in the form of the accessibility and accommodations guidelines that are intended to come out later this calendar year for public review and to be finalized early in the next calendar year. So a lot of work coming up over the next academic year around accessibilities and accommodations. For those of you who have access to the ELC portal, you can take a look at the video of the panel on diverse learners and hear a few folks talking about embedded accommodations, which I think took place in ELC Cohort 2 in particular. So you might want to just take a look at that video when you have a few minutes. So I think that pretty much wraps up most of the additional tools or additional pieces that PARCC would want to release with the sample items. That second question, what additional tools, resources, etc. do you need to do your work and to work with your colleagues? And are your in-state ELCs planning to create any of these? If so, we'd be really interested to see what you're coming up with. So for PARCC, what additional tools resources could PARCC create to support your work and your work with your colleagues? A sample score report would be great. Any other additional tools or resources beyond samples of student work and sample score reports? And of course, the need for more information on accommodations and accessibility. Flowcharts, keys to acronyms. Yes, there are plenty of those. K2 samples, something that PARCC is still considering. It's really at this point kind of a feasibility question for PARCC, being able to get enough capacity out on the field to actually, develop that particular set of tools around K2. That's something that is a lively conversation happening right now, actually, around K2. Sample lessons for teaching, reading, in science and or social studies. So one thing I'll tell you that PARCC will not be developing is sample lessons. That is something that the PARCC states individually have claimed as their own along with their districts. However, I think there's a wonderful opportunity here for ELC members to be sharing the lessons that you are creating in this respect, so that even though PARCC's not creating these pieces, you're still benefiting from the collaboration that comes from being as part of a consortium. Samples of instructional shifts, meaning what was considered best practice juxtaposed with what would be best practice now. I think we'll probably see some of that coming out of the EQUIP work. Professional development modules can be used with teachers to help keep the message from PARCC clear, right? And that is actually something that PARCC is planning to develop next year through the assessment professional development modules. Thank you. Technology-based assessment pilots or trials. PARCC has been planning for the first field testing, the first full-scale field testing, to actually have it happen in kind of two ways. Think of one circle embedded in another circle. In the bigger circle, that'll be the full-scale field test, which not all schools will have access to. That'll be based on statistical models and what's needed to make sure that the right demographics are attended to and taking a look at those items. But PARCC is looking at the possibility of creating a portion of that field test which could be usable by all schools who choose to do it. So even though it wouldn't be the full-scale field test, it might be just a snapshot of it to help folks get a better understanding of what the technology is going to look like in more of a practice-like setting. Recommended professional development reading list that empowers educators with best practices. I agree with Phyllis. Videos of best instructional practices, great. And there might be a possibility for PARCC to partner with some key organizations like NCTE or IRA or others to think about what those videos could look like. And Sue, I'm sure you have some ideas floating around in your head as well there. Timeframes for test administration at each grade level per test administration. How long will the test take? How many times? That's actually getting teed up at the governing board meeting next week. So while I don't have information for you right now about testing times, that is something that PARCC is acutely aware is important information to get out to you just as soon as it is ready to go. And a nice resource shared by Neil. Great Books Foundation's Shared Inquiry Method seems directly in line with PARCC's reading and writing goals. A clear timeline for recommendations for preparing for implementations. Seems to be a range of perspectives on this. Sorry, things are moving fast. Seems to be a range of perspectives of relationship of PARCC assessments and Common Core. Well, that's an interesting second point, that there seems to be a range of perspectives of relationship of PARCC assessments and the Common Core. I think for general purposes, the most important thing to keep in mind is that PARCC is assessing the Common Core state standards. There really are no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So if you are looking at the content frameworks, you're looking at how PARCC is planning to assess the Common Core state standards. As you look at the sample items and prototypes, you're looking at how the content frameworks and the content frameworks and really the standards themselves are coming to life in actual items. So while I'm sure there is a lot of noise out there in the streets about what's the relationship, I think the most important thing, again, to keep in mind, that PARCC is assessing the Common Core state standards.
And Doug, I would just say amen to that. This is Sue. Having spent weeks and months on the development of the Common Core state standards with folks across the nation, and looking now at what you heard Bonnie talk about in terms of Standard 1 and Standard 10, complex text and evidence always in play, whatever the question. I just really see the heart and soul of what's different about the Common Core and what will prepare our students is really getting enshrined in the PARCC assessment.
Thanks, Sue. And the additional tools I'm seeing coming up now are communications tools to a large degree that really just help summarize things and get things in a quick and easy to read place. So while there's quite a bit at in the parconline.org website, and I think the ELC portal will have some of these, PARCC is endeavoring to create a number of additional communications tools, and so these ideas are very helpful in fleshing out that suite of tools that are going to be developed in the near future. And then one person writes, links to sample questions embedded directly in the Common Core state standards. I'm not sure who sent that to Allison, but I would encourage you not to hold your breath on that. The Common Core state standards are, managed by Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association, which do not have a direct affiliation with either PARCC or the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. And because of that, I don't see them anytime soon actually making adjustments to the standards to align with one or the other assessment systems, or potentially even either assessment system. So at least for the workable future, next 3 to 5 years, I would encourage you to keep a close eye on the parconline.org website. Can you give assessment creation questions, heuristics for teachers when creating their own assessments? Bonnie, do you want to respond to that question? And Jonathan, thanks for your patience in asking again.
So PARCC is gathering together the evidence statements for reading standards. We're in the copy editing stage. In fact, we did some additional copy edits today. And once those reading evidence statements are put out on the website, I believe that you'll see that they will form for you some ideas for how you might ask for or elicit evidence related to this, not related, directly linked to the reading standards. But one of the difficulties in creating any kind of heuristic is that one of the differences in Common Core really goes to using these rich, complex texts and maximizing what questions beg to be asked of the text. And Sue may want to say a little bit more here, but it's important that the questions themselves that are asked be text-based and connected to the standards. So sometimes when you see the templated questions, they really don't get to that close analytic reading of a specific text. So looking for that balance. But I think when you see those evidence statements, that will be a tool that you'll be able to use, and we'll be mindful to give some examples of how to use those as those are released. And that should be within the next, I would say, I'm going to say 3 to 4 weeks at the outset.
And Bonnie, this is Sue, and I just want to underscore something you said, because I think it's so important, and that is that PARCC is really looking for, and when you're writing your own assessments, what questions begged to get asked by the text. In other words, what is it that's crucial and central to the text to be asking the students? And that's one thing I want to say. The second I want to say is when you were going over the Amelia Earhart item and you talked about the summary, you didn't just ask for a summary. You could have just said, summarize the text, but it was around the challenges that Earhart, had faced in her life. And so there's a place there, I think, and you underscored it there as well, that it's not just a fill in the blank. Here's the standard. The standard asks for summary, so we're going to ask for summary, but it's really thoughtful about what is it we want students to be able to get from the Amelia Earhart piece, and it is about the challenges that then helped put her, get her personality together. You kind of understand that, you understand what shaped her, and then led her to her final flight. So it's those kinds of things that I think can be helpful as people. There are also some resources around You can go to Achieve the Core that has some things around writing text-dependent questions, and Bonnie Park may have some of those as well, that really talks about, what do you look for when you write a text-dependent question, and there is some help in that. And also, as you heard in the publisher's criteria, there's some talk about that as well, and that may be another resource people can use.
All right, thanks to you both. So I think we had one last question, and I think we're going to wrap it up today because we're starting to bump up against our stop time. And that question was, will the end-of-year assessment only be reading for all grade levels, no writing on the end-of-year assessment for anyone? So, Bonnie, you want to respond?
I'm sorry, Doug, I didn't hear you. Can you repeat the question?
I can. The question was, will the end-of-year assessment only be on reading for all grade levels?
Yes.
Or will there be writing on the end-of-year assessment as well?
Yes, so the end-of-year assessment does only measure reading and does not measure writing at any of the grade levels. This was because we wanted writing to be measured by students actually writing. That means that there needs to be time for the scorers to read those responses, and we wanted data to come back in time for the end of the year. So all of the writing was placed on the performance-based assessment, and the end-of-year assessment is devoted solely to reading. The performance-based assessment does also have reading. So performance-based assessment, reading and writing, end-of-year assessment, reading only.
And just to underscore again that the performance-based assessment, along with what they call the end-of-year assessment, is together, those two create the score, if you will. And on the performance-based assessment, Bonnie, help me here, are there 4 writing?
There are.
There's 4 writing assignments, which are really wonderful because rather than just a single example of students writing, there will be 4, and they will be of different types and sorts, to different types and sorts of text. So I think that's exciting as well.
All right, thanks to you both. So I think that's it for the questions and also about it for our time today. Really appreciate everybody's participation and sharing of ideas. As Allison noted in the chat feature, this PowerPoint and the webinar, the audio, and everything's going to be saved and uploaded to at least the ELC portal and very likely parconline.org as well. So we encourage you to go ahead and make use of that as you need to. Definitely it'll be on the ELC portal. And so I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today and thank all of you for spending a little bit of time with us talking about these important topics and also for sharing your sage wisdom with us as we get ready to make another round of tools for your use out in the field. Please don't hesitate to shoot us a note if anything else comes up, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.